Welcome virtually to the Salem Athenaeum. I'm Diane Stern, a member of the Athenaeum's Programming Committee. When we saw that a new book had been written about Judy Blume, whose books for children, in fact, I happen to have one right here, and books for adults have been so successful over many decades, we thought we need to check this out. And I'm so glad that we did. Judy Blume is an icon, as you all know, and the Genius of Judy, how Judy Blume rewrote childhood for all of us, covers not only her life, but the times in which she wrote, eerily similar to now, I might add, and the risks Blume took with her bold writing about growing up, sexuality, divorce, the role of women beyond the kitchen and nursery and bedroom. And we'll have more on that in just a moment. But first, a quick reminder to put your questions in the Q&A, and I would expect you to have a lot of questions because we all know Judy Blume and love her. And now to our guest tonight. Rachelle Bergstein is a best-selling, widely translated author and editor with a focus on lifestyle, pop culture, and families. Her articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Post, the Washington Post, Forbes, just to name a few. Her book about Judy Blume is a USA Today bestseller, a notable nonfiction pick by Library Reads, and BookPage calls it groundbreaking. It's our pleasure now to introduce and welcome Rachelle. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I understand it's from New York.
It's from New York. Thank you so much. When that book page review came out, my stepfather asked me who I paid there because that was just not a word that we were expecting. He was joking. He has a sort of a dark sense of humor.
No,
But yeah, it was a wonderful review, and I'm so happy to be here and talk about my book tonight.
that's wonderful.
Let me start by sharing my screen as I have a little slideshow prepared. Okay. Nope, not my email. Okay. All right. So when I started researching this book, I didn't really realize how much it was going to land in a moment that was so devoted to Judy Blume. People have described this as the Judy Blumeissance because everyone seems to be celebrating her impact and her contributions so much these days, whether it's her documentary that was on Amazon, the film adaptation of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, the various profiles that were done of her during the time that she was promoting those things. But when I started working on this book, the thing that I wanted to investigate that was really important to me, which I felt like nobody had really quite answered yet, was what is it about Judy Blume's work that makes it so sticky, that makes it feel so special to people? Um, when writers who were her contemporaries, like Norma Klein, like Betty Miles, they've sort of receded into history. Anytime I talk to people about my research when I was writing this book, women of a certain age, of a particular age, would get this glassy look in their eye, almost like they were recalling a former boyfriend or something. And one writer that I was speaking to at a book party, when I told her what I was working on, she said, "Oh, Judy Blume, you just get to make people happy." So if you're here tonight, I'm guessing that you are a fan of Judy's. Or maybe you're here because you keep hearing Judy Blume's name over and over, and you're wondering what it is about her that makes people so emotional when they think about her. So, to start out answering that question, I'm actually going to read a few passages, not from my book, but from her work. And just a heads up, some of these get a little frank, as Judy likes to say. So, if you're sensitive about body stuff, just earmuffs. This is a quote from Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, which was published in 1970. The main character, if you don't know, is 11-year-old Margaret. She has just moved from New York City to the fictional town of Farbrook, New Jersey, and she's hoping that she's going to make friends. Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret. Gretchen, my friend, got her period. I'm so jealous, God. I hate myself for being so jealous, but I am. I wish you'd help me just a little. Nancy's sure she's going to get it soon, too. And if I'm last, I don't know what I'll do. Oh, please, God. I just want to be normal. This next quote is from the book It's Not the End of the World. It's about a young girl named Karen who is 12 and her parents are getting divorced and she is not happy about it. What will happen to me if they get divorced? Who will I live with? Where will I go to school? Will my friends laugh? I want a mother and a father, and I want them to live together right here in this house. I don't care if they fight. I would rather have them fight than be divorced. I'm scared. I'm so scared. I wish somebody would talk to me and tell me if it's going to be all right. I miss Daddy already. I hate them both. I wish I was dead. And this last quote that I'm going to read is from the book Deanie, which is about a 13-year-old girl who I want to say she's aspiring to be a model, but that's not totally accurate. Her mother wants her to be a model because she's very pretty. But those plans get derailed when Deanie gets diagnosed with scoliosis and finds out she's going to have to wear a back brace. Deanie's also going through puberty, and this is a scene that takes place in a health class in her middle school. And the person that's talking is Mrs. Rappaport, the health teacher. Does anyone know the word for stimulating our genitals? Because that's what we're talking about, you know. It got very quiet in the gym. Nobody said anything for a very long time. Then one girl spoke. I think it's called masturbation. That's right, Mrs. Rappaport told us, and it's not a word you should be afraid of. Let's all say it. Masturbation, we said together. Okay, Mrs. Rappaport said. Now that you've said it, let me try to explain. First of all, it's normal and harmless to masturbate. These books were published in 1970, 1972, and 1973, respectively. Today, 50 years later, we're still debating whether topics like periods, divorce, and sexuality belong in books for children. So it makes you wonder, where did Judy Blume get the confidence to write about these things in the early 1970s? This picture is Judy Blume with her children back in the 60s, in 1966. The boy is Larry, and the girl wearing the little graduation cap is Randy. A bit about Judy Blume before she had her children. She was born Judith Sussman on February 12th, 1938. She was born in the great state of New Jersey, the daughter of a dentist and a homemaker. She was Jewish, and given her age, the stories out of World War II shaped her. She was the younger of two children, and her older brother was the difficult one. Judy had a typical middle-class 1950s upbringing, which is to say, repressed. She was raised to be pretty, popular, and happy. There wasn't a lot of room in her house for tough feelings. She felt her older brother sucked up most of the air. But she had a very fulfilling creative life. She told herself stories, she took dance classes, she performed in plays, she edited the school newspaper. She went to college at NYU for a degree in education, but she wasn't expected to use it. She was expected to find a husband. And she did that. She did it well. She married young in her early 20s, and by the time that she was 25 years old, she had two kids. She had a lovely life on paper, country club outings, leisure time, dinners at good restaurants, but she wasn't really enjoying it. First of all, she was sick all the time. She had sore throats, rashes, fevers, headaches, none of which the doctor could explain. So when her children started in school full time, she took an unconventional approach. She tried rekindling her childhood creativity. She remembered a time when she felt more alive, and she wondered if part of that was her participation in all these creative endeavors. This is one of my favorite parts of Judy's story, and it's that she wasn't instantly drawn to writing. She wasn't a born writer. She didn't instantly find success as a writer. In fact, she first thought that maybe she would start writing songs. She would hum along with the radio and think about whether she could, write songs like the Beatles, but it turns out she wasn't John Lennon. Then she bought a whole bunch of felt and she started making these pendants to hang in children's bedrooms, and she actually sold them at Bloomingdale's for a brief time and probably would have continued doing that if she hadn't developed an allergy to the fabric glue she was using that made the skin on her hands peel. And I think about that a lot. If Judy Blume hadn't developed an allergy to fabric glue, we wouldn't have gotten maybe all of the wonderful books that she's created. But allergic she was. And at one point, like many creative parents, she was reading to her children before bed at night. And she was thinking to herself, I mean, how hard could it be to write a children's book? Her maiden name had been Sussman. She would read Dr. Seuss books and think maybe I could be, Mrs. Suss of New Jersey. So she started playing around. She started, rhyming words and writing sweet little stories and creating illustrations to go along with them. She wasn't great at drawing, but she did feel that she maybe had a knack for writing, that there was something about writing that was clicking for her. And then she got something in the mail that felt like it was sent there just for her. It was a continuing education pamphlet from NYU, her alma mater, and one of the classes was a class called Writing Books for Children. She decided to sign up. She convinced her husband that one night a week she was going to take the bus into the city and he was going to have to get the kids dinner and get them ready for bed, and he agreed. So Judy started taking this class and she realized she absolutely loved it. She was influenced by the children's books that were coming out, at the time that she had young kids, the children's books that even she had read as a child. And some of them were really excellent. There were books written in the middle of the 20th century, but two things tended to be true about them. They were either fantastical or they had a strong moral, and sometimes it was both. Think about books like A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle or any of the Roald Dahl books. You know, you get weird talking giants in Roald Dahl books, but oftentimes good triumphs over evil. If you think about books like Charlotte's Web, you have all of these talking animals on the farm, but there are life lessons baked into these stories. Judy tried experimenting with a lot of different forms. She tried fantasy, she tried first person, she tried third person, but her teacher at NYU told her that she felt like she had a knack for writing realistic fiction, kind of in the vein of Beverly Cleary. And now we think of Beverly Cleary as such a classic children's writer, but back when she was writing, she was actually doing something a little different too. The stories that she told were just about regular middle class children doing regular things like going to school, making friends, arguing with their sisters and brothers. Um, but they subscribed to the unwritten rule of children's writing, which was that the parents tended to always be right. When you think of Ramona, she's zany, she's interesting, she makes mistakes, but her parents are always there to guide her. And Judy loved Beverly Cleary, but she didn't necessarily subscribe to this idea that the parents were always in the right. The book that Judy started working on in this class at NYU, which she actually took twice, is called Iggy's House. And this is one of her very first publications. And it was the first book she published with a new publisher called Bradbury Press. This is another detail that I really love about Judy's story. Her writing was discovered in the slush pile. And if you know anything about publishing, that's like a fantasy come true for a writer, right? She wasn't agented, she wasn't represented. Her book wasn't solicited. She responded to an ad that she saw for this new publisher looking for interesting, kind of inventive books for readers of a very specific age, what we would now call middle grade readers, and that's kids from like 8 to 12. They're not children and they're not teenagers. Um, and the book that Judy used to get their attention. She's later said is not her favorite of her books. It's one of her early ones. She feels like she improved as a writer since she published it, and that's very much true if you go back and read this book. But you see inklings of who Judy would become as a writer. And one of the things that's so impressive about Iggy's House is that she immediately took on subjects that would be controversial in the time. Iggy's House is about an 11-year-old who is alarmed to see that her neighbors are not responding very well to the fact that a Black family is moving next door to her. She's very excited to meet this family that she, bumbles and describes as being from Africa when they're actually from Detroit. But she's horrified to see that many of the adults in her community are actively trying to chase off this Black family. And in fact, her parents, while they're not being so vile as that, they're actually not doing much to stop what some of the more racist community members are doing. So, Judy, in this children's book, she takes on issues like blockbusting, like racism, like redlining, and she does it through the voice of a young girl who's grappling with seeing the adults in her life and her parents not behave in a way that she thinks is morally just. Judy Blume wasn't writing in a vacuum. When she started publishing in the early 1970s, there was a light cast by a book that came out in the mid 60s called The Feminine Mystique. And of course, this is Betty Friedan who wrote it. And when the Feminine Mystique came out, it created quite a splash because the writer Betty Friedan, she described what we would now call housewives ennui. She was saying that there were all of these creative, intelligent, educated, middle-class women out there who had then, had children and gone into their homes and they were losing their minds. They were bored beyond belief. They loved their kids. They loved their husbands even, but they were so unhappy. They felt isolated and they felt guilty that they were unhappy because they were told over and over through various different ways in the media and in magazines that they were the luckiest women ever to have been born. They had all of these wonderful things. They had dishwashers, they had, you know, washing machines in the home. They could cook beautiful recipes from Betty Crocker. But as Betty Friedan described it, many of these women suffered from what she called the problem that has no name. And one of the aspects of the problem that has no name was something that Betty Friedan called housewife's blight. And housewife's blight was these weird illnesses that these women couldn't explain, much like Judy Blume was experiencing: rashes, sore throats, fatigue, flu-like symptoms that doctors couldn't diagnose properly, that were all related to these psychological yearnings for something more. Um, the feminine mystique, it sparked a movement. When we think of the 1970s, we think of second wave feminism, or as it was then called, the women's movement. And Judy, while she wasn't out there marching on Fifth Avenue, she wasn't waving her banner that said Women Unite. She was very influenced by what she was learning about the women's movement and what she was reading in magazines and what she was seeing on television. And this was kind of a eureka moment for me when I was doing my research. I knew I was writing about Judy. I was trying to get to the heart of what makes her work so special. And in doing that, I started rereading all of these works by early second wave feminists, like The Feminine Mystique, like Sexual Politics by Kate Millett. And I noticed a theme, which was that the second wavers are consistent when they talk about first wave feminists who are the suffragettes. They say that these women did formidable work, marching and campaigning for the vote, but they made one big mistake. They didn't have a plan for the feminist movement after they achieved their goals. In other words, once the women's vote was codified in 1919, the movement kind of fell apart. And a lot of these writers were saying this. They were saying that any civil rights movement needs a multi-generational buy-in in order to secure its longevity. And that's what Judy Blume was doing with her books. It was like a light bulb went off. She wasn't marching down Fifth Avenue, but she was doing something arguably just as important. She was processing the messages of the women's movement in real time and translating it for young people in her stories. One of the major initiatives of the rights movement was to help women feel more in touch with their bodies. Think of Our Bodies, Ourselves, the very famous book that women as a collective wrote to understand and demystify what was going on in their bodies during pregnancy, during sex, during their periods. Well, Judy Blume's books became sort of like Our Bodies, Ourselves type primers for younger people. Um, in Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, as the quote I read earlier indicates, Margaret is very fascinated. She's very compelled by, she's very excited by the idea of her body changing. Puberty is something so exciting and exotic for her and her friends that they actually have competitions about it. They do the famous we must increase our bust exercises, and they talk about their periods in a way that it gets competitive. Margaret prays not to be the last of her girlfriends to get her period. And when her friends get theirs first, she's truly devastated. She's actually embarrassed. Um, Judy Blume framed getting your period as something that is not only something to celebrate, but it's something that young girls are so locked in about that they are crying about it to each other. This was something that had never been put down on the page. And speaking of things that had never been put down on the page, Deanie, in the same way, talks about masturbation, and that's something that even now we feel like is very controversial, not just to talk about masturbation in a book, but to talk about masturbation in a book where a girl is doing it. The book is not explicit in how it talks about masturbation, but there is that scene that I read earlier where Judy Blume makes it very clear that this is something that Deanie is doing. And Deanie actually wonders at one point in the book if by touching her special place, she gave herself scoliosis, and the conversation she has in her health class is extremely reassuring for her. It's almost as if Judy Blume is trying to reach across the page and reassure her young readers that you're not going to be disfigured, that these old myths about masturbation, that all of these terrible things are going to happen to you if you do it, that you're going to go crazy, they're not true. One of Judy Blume's boldest books is a book called Forever, which she published in 1975. And this book was actually inspired by her daughter, Randy. Randy was Judy's first editor from a very young age. Randy loved reading her mother's books. Judy would run them by her, not just to get her reaction, but also because Randy was a young person in the home. So Randy could say, "Oh, kids don't use that word," or "Mom, like kids don't listen to that kind of music," or whatever. She would actually bring an additional ring of authenticity to Judy's pages. And Randy, when she was, an early teenager, 12, 13, 14 years old, was reading all of these books that were popular with kids her age, which um, they all followed a similar rubric. So a boy and girl would fall in love, they would decide to have sex, and then their lives were instantaneously ruined. Someone would get pregnant, someone would have a back alley abortion and die, people would have to get married and they would miss their high school graduations and they would be flung into poverty. Every time people, and especially girls, had sex in books, um, they experienced a terrible fate, including death. So Randy said to her mother, "Mom, I would just like to read a book about teenagers where they have sex and they don't die." And Judy was inspired by that. And this is the book that she delivered. She showed two kids. Their names are Michael and Catherine, and they're really good kids. Judy makes every effort to show us how good they are. They're great students. They're applying to great colleges. They're connected to their families. Catherine, the main character, is a candy striper at a hospital. Um, but they fall in love. They're seniors in high school, and they believe they're going to be together forever. They're so deeply in love that they think that this is it. They found their people, and they decide to have sex. But they do it in a way that's really responsible, both emotionally and physically. Catherine, she waits until she's ready. Michael, in sort of a stereotypical guy fashion, is the one urging her along. He's rushing her a little bit, and she says, "No, I'm not ready," and she makes him wait. She also she makes a Planned Parenthood visit all by herself. She goes, she gets an exam. The doctors don't judge her there. She asks for the birth control pill, and it's not until she has contraception that she decides to actually have sex with Michael. So, um, Judy Blume was giving kids an alternate story for what happens when you decide that you're ready to have sex and you're in love. Um, Catherine and Michael don't die. In fact, they do break up at the end. Catherine realizes that she is too young to commit to her boyfriend forever, and she actually gets a crush on someone else, and she breaks up with Michael, and it's sad. He's really upset. He's hysterically crying. He's flushing the toilet in the bathroom to make sure that she doesn't hear him, but she still can. Um, but there's a real sense in this book that they are going to go on with their lives and that it wasn't a mistake. Catherine doesn't feel embarrassed that she's lost her virginity. She feels like it was sufficiently special and she's happy with her choices. I've included this timeline because I would like you to see how quickly Judy was putting out books once she got started. This is just a small sampling of the books that she put out between 1970 and 1980, but we have Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, Tales of Fourth Grade Nothing, Deanie, Blubber, Forever, starring Sally J. Friedman as herself in 1977. So within 7 years, she puts out many of what would become her most iconic books. She is writing up a storm, and it really changes her life. Judy Blume became a huge success. Um, Tales of Fourth Grade Nothing alone, that was a book that did crazy numbers in publishing. It really changed her economic reality and it allowed her to leave a marriage that she felt wasn't fulfilling. She's written a lot and talked a lot about her first marriage to a man named John Bloom. And the divorce was very hard. It was very hard on the children, but Judy has said repeatedly that if she didn't have the economic umbrella that she had because of her writing, she might not have been able to make the decision to leave and change her life. Um, Her books came out in paperback in the mid 70s, and that really changed how kids were talking about them and sharing them. A hardcover book like it is today, it's less accessible to a child to go to a store and buy with their own money. But once Bloom's books were out in paperback, kids were buying them, they were sharing them, they were hiding them under their beds. Um, Forever made Judy a hero with so many teenagers, many of whom were reading it surreptitiously, with a flashlight under the covers, after their parents thought they had gone to bed. But it didn't necessarily win her over to the parents. Judy Blume, she withstood a lot of criticism even early on in her career. And one of the things that people said about her work over and over was that it wasn't literary. It wasn't literary. It was junk food. Kids were reading it the way that they would pop popcorn and M&Ms, but they should really be reading the classics. She really didn't get her due from the literary world. And this is just an example of one of the horrible reviews of her work that came out at the height of her popularity. The literary gatekeepers weren't impressed with her. They thought her language was overly simple, her descriptions were subpar, and that children would be better off just ignoring Fudge's antics. In 1980, an English writer named David Rees published a book called The Marble in the Water, Essays on Contemporary Writers of Fiction for Children and Young Adults. This essay, Not Even for a One-Night Stand, Judy Blume, took down Judy's writing as shopping list prose and, quote, excruciating. The whole thing was so over the top that it would likely go viral if it were published today. And here's just one passage. Judy Blume's novels are the ultimate in read it and throw it away kind of book. In other words, they are not only shortchanging the young, they are shortchanging literature. Ouch. I share this because she was already at a bit of a low and she became the target of another campaign against her books, and that was book banning. Um, in the late 1970s, the conservative grassroots movement was gaining ground, most notably with the Moral Majority and Phyllis Schlafly's The Eagle Forum. Schlafly actually circulated a pamphlet called How to Rid Your Schools of Judy Blume. Then Ronald Reagan was elected, and these groups became emboldened. One of their missions was to purge school libraries of books they deemed to be inappropriate. By 1982, book challenges across the country had surged to such an extent that the American Library Association founded its very first Banned Books Week. Judy and her books were challenged so frequently that for a time in the 1980s, she held the dubious honor of being the country's most banned writer. This picture was sent to me by Norma Klein's daughter. So Norma Klein, you'll see her on the top right of this poster, and she also wrote controversial books for young adult readers. She died young, actually, in the 90s, but her daughter is a women's studies professor, and she said this is one of her most prized possessions. This is a poster put out by the American Library Association, and you'll see Judy Blume in the center. It's various writers who were censored during the book banning crisis of the 1980s. And you'll see James Baldwin and Shakespeare and Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller. And amazingly enough, this campaign to ban Judy Blume's books actually it elevated her. So people in the literary world finally started taking her seriously. When you put her in the context of people like Maya Angelou, literary gatekeepers started paying attention. Um, Norma Klein, when she saw this poster and when she would read that she had been banned in the same breath as someone like Shakespeare, she used to joke that I'll never be in such good company again. One of the books that was frequently banned of Judy's was a book called Blubber, which came out in 1974. And, Forever is a book that's more obvious in terms of why it's been banned. It's pretty sexually frank and explicit. Even now, today in Utah, it was banned quite recently. But Blubber was a book that took Judy by surprise when it started being banned, because there is no sexual content. There's one dirty word, but among various books that talk about things like menstruation and masturbation and virginity, this book seemed to Judy pretty non-controversial. However, If you remember what I said about children's books having to have a moral, this is a book that quite explicitly and defiantly does not have a moral. This is a book that I remember reading as a young girl, and it's so cruel, it kind of made my stomach hurt. This is a very no holds barred depiction of bullying in the classroom. And it was inspired by something that Randy was actually experiencing in her own classroom. She wasn't bullying or being bullied, but she was seeing it happen among girls in her class. Um, this is a book about a girl who's slightly overweight who becomes the target of class-wide bullying. They start calling her Blubber, and the teacher is checked out. She doesn't do anything. Um, the parents don't do anything. There really is no lesson in this book that's made explicit, that's spelled out. The only lesson you can take from it is that the person who's being bullied, a girl named Linda, she actually becomes the bullier at the end of the book. And you see that kids are just, you know, it's a rotating thing, like who gets bullied and who is the bully, like kids are very capricious in this way. The idea of book bans is sadly quite familiar now. I'm sure a lot of this is striking a chord as you're listening because after book banners backed off in the 1990s, we're now experiencing a second wave of book banning that is even more aggressive than the first. Attempted book bans hit a record high in 2023, with thousands of books being removed from schools and school libraries, and countless more removed in what I would like to call backdoor book bans, where teachers or librarians are afraid of losing their jobs or worse if they use certain books in their classrooms. One library in Idaho recently had to go adults only because they don't have the space to accommodate a new law that says books for adults, which includes books about puberty, need to be a certain specific distance away from books for children. I don't know about you, but I don't really feel like adults need books for puberty. So putting it in the adult section in a book that in a library that has banned children is more or less banning it, even if you don't call it a book ban. Um, Judy Blume came back from her time as one of the country's most banned writers by becoming a pioneer of anti-censorship. And she has said very vocally that she feels the attempted bans are even worse this time around because they aren't coming just from grassroots groups, but instead from the politicians themselves. I got this slide from the American Library Association, and some of the books shown here are among the most banned at this moment. So we see Genderqueer, a book called Flamer. This book is gay, All Boys Aren't Blue. A lot of the books that are being targeted now are books that describe the LGBTQ experience or an LGBTQ experience that genderqueer, of course, talks about being gender nonconforming and ultimately coming out as transgender. And these are books that certain politicians want to keep away from children. You also see that some classics are still controversial. I was just thinking about The Bluest Eye today. Politicians will say, or book banners will say, that this book is being removed because of the sexual content. It does describe a girl who is the victim of incest, but it also is about internalized white supremacy. And that idea is very threatening in a world where, critical race theory has become a buzzword. I spoke to so many librarians and sex educators for this project who stress the importance of getting information to children. Kids who learn about their bodies and their hearts are less likely to be victims of sexual abuse and violence. That's been studied. Right now, Judy's books are being targeted less, though Forever was banned in Utah, as I said just a few months ago. But more often, we're seeing books, like I said, about the LGBTQ experience and also books about Black lives that are being removed from schools and from libraries. Books teach empathy. The more we learn about people who are different from us, the more likely we are to treat each other kindly when we encounter people who are different in real life. This is Judy Blume's legacy. She took serious risks in her work to make sure children grew up with the answers to their deepest and most personal questions. She envisioned a world where kids explored their most complex thoughts within the safety of their bedrooms between the covers of a paperback. She took the lives of children seriously, and in doing so, she gave her young readers permission to see themselves as full human beings. She also paved the way for countless other writers to write about bold and honest topics in books for children. In terms of literature, we're still feeling the enormity of her impact today. I want to put up my socials. I don't know if you can see them. I can share them in the chat, but I want to keep the conversation going. I have a Substack called Banner Year where I write about the current book bans because Judy has really inspired me to get involved and to learn more about what's happening in this country. So please, let's connect and, you know, talk about this more over the next few years because I think the topic is not going away anytime soon.
Rachelle, this was great. Thank you so much for joining us. And in
Oh,
fact,
thank you.
that was one of the questions I was going to ask you a little bit about your Substack, which is called Banner Year. So this is something that you've recently started, or since researching the book on Judy Blume, or
I started it about a year ago and it was inspired by Judy, you know, reading about the book bans that she confronted and that ultimately strengthens her as a pioneer of anti-censorship. It made me really want to learn more about that, especially because we're seeing book bans happen now. And I was talking to so many librarians for this book who confessed to me that this is probably the most difficult time in their lives of being librarians, and that nobody went into this industry thinking that they were going to be on the front lines of a cultural war. So yeah, I feel it's really important to stay um, conscious of what's going on and to learn about what's happening. I live in New York, so it's not necessarily happening here as much, but learn about what's happening in other states so that when it comes closer to us, we can be prepared.
yeah, it was last year that the Athenaeum invited two area librarians to discuss the challenges of book banning, and they were talking about groups like Moms for Liberty, which I'm sure you're aware of too.
Yes, yes. I mean, groups like that, they're very organized. And like I said in my presentation, unlike in the 1980s, they have very direct political backing. So before, you know, there was a conservative grassroots movement that was coming for books, and now the politicians that represent those voters are coming for books as well. So it's a top-down strategy, and it's one that we really need to be aware of.
I really want to check that out. So it's called Banner Year.
Banner year, yes.
Okay. Let's get back to Judy. What surprised you most? I know you talked about the light bulb moment when you could see that feminism informed her writing, but what surprised you most beyond that in your research and writing about Judy Blume?
Well, like I said, I mean, it really surprised me that she wasn't an overnight success and that she had dealt with so much criticism, frankly, even beyond before the book bans, you know, that I spoke to someone, he wasn't the editor-in-chief at the time, but he was recently the editor-in-chief of a publication called The Horn Book, which I think probably a lot of librarians are familiar with, and they couldn't stand Judy Blume. Um, they were the ones saying, you know, this is not literary writing. This is not quality. You know, that's something that came up over and over in her reviews. This is, well, we know it's not quality, but you know, very condescending stuff. So it was interesting to me to see that she kind of had to wait out those criticisms for her legacy to come into focus, you know, that she had to just drown it out and say, okay, you know what, I'm not literary, but I'm selling books and who cares? And ultimately, you know, a lot more people came to recognize what she was contributing.
Yes, and all the lives that, she either changed or affected in some way. Speaking about things like divorce, annoying brothers, and I'm thinking about Fudge.
Hmm.
Um, just the roles of women. I mean, it just affected so many people, and certainly people who have struggled with scoliosis. Just that one book, Deanie.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that because I spent a lot of her time at her archives at Yale, and one of the major pieces of her archive are all of the letters she was receiving from children at the height of her popularity. Handwritten, careful, thought out, confessional, just incredibly candid and intimate letters from kids over and over and over again. So I do know that while, you know, Judy Blume was getting maybe some kiss off reviews here and there, she was hearing directly from her readers that her books were making a difference. And I know that for Norma Klein as well, that is what got her through. Um, Hearing that her books were helping people, that they felt close to her in some cases, closer than they did to their parents. She felt like she had a responsibility to those children. Critics be damned.
All right. And she gave them an outlet. Yeah. Another thing I'd like to talk about is Judy Blume's gift for humor.
Hmm.
So at the beginning, I showed you the book, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. Well, I used to come home from work, usually quite late, but our daughter was still up. And I would up to her room and I would read her Judy Blume stories, all the Fudge books. This one and Super Fudge is another. And thank goodness she's kept them because they're classics. They're still funny, I think. Her humor is just uh it's for everyone, I think.
She is very funny. And Super Fudge is actually the first book, and I have a very clear memory of this. It's the first book that made me laugh out loud as a child. I remember reading it on my bedroom floor and giggling uncontrollably and thinking to myself, having this kind of like out of body moment, like, I can't believe I'm laughing so hard at this book by myself. And then cut to me researching Judy Blume, and I have a now 9-year-old son. And what a joy was it to do some of the research with him for this book. I was able to lie in bed with him and read all of the Fudge books and read some Beverly Cleary books and just include him. But the Fudge books were just as funny to him as they were to me. And in fact, like the things that were making me laugh at Super Fudge as an 8-year-old were making him laugh as an 8-year-old. So there is a real timelessness to her humor, and she just really has a talent for it. I remember reading an interview with her where she said, she knew she was being funny when she was making herself laugh, write something. And you can feel that. You can feel the joy in making herself and making kids laugh in her work.
So you're saying that her books have really aged well. And does that go beyond humor?
I think that they have for the most part. I think that, and this is kind of the crux of what makes her so special in a lot of ways. Her books kind of strike to the heart of the pre-adolescent and adolescent experience, right? And while, we can say now, well, so much has changed with technology, kids grow up faster, they have cell phones or whatever, there's still a universality to your body changing, your relationship with your parents changing, your relationship with your friends changing, that I don't think depends on whether or not you can text. And I think that Judy was the first to really honor these childhood experiences um, without judgment. And I think kids still feel that now when they read her books. I know from speaking to librarians, they're not as popular as they used to be. Kids have a lot of different options. The YA genre is really bustling and competitive and bright and all of the things that I think Judy really is very happy to see, right? Like, but she does when kids get their hands on her books because their parents are like, I loved this one, you have to read it. Kids still like them.
Oh, yeah. And you can really see why. Well, Rochelle, I want to thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I know everyone else did too. And happily, this is being recorded. So people like my daughter who couldn't tune in tonight can see it later. And we'll let you all know when that happens. The Genius of Judy is available through bookshop.org. Our LitFest partner, Wicked Good Books in Salem, and of course, your favorite bookstore. It would make a great holiday gift, come to think of it. I enjoyed it so much. Thanks to our audience, we appreciate your support of the Salem Athenaeum, which relies on the generosity of our members and the community to keep offering programs just like this one, and Salem Lit Fest, which is every year, each September. Coming up this weekend, Salem Athenaeum is a featured building in this year's Christmas in Salem Holiday House Tour. You can check out our book tree. Those of you who are members or who are associated with the Athenaeum in any way, you know what that looks like. It's really very cool. And there'll be other surprises as well. There's more info about that and other upcoming events at salemathenaeum.net. Again, thank you all, and thank you, Rochelle. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet.